So I'll try and I think throw up few contemporary dynamics that are emerging in Indian democracy and where does Maoist movement or a revolutionary imagination as such stand vis-a-vis constitutional morality, and then put forth certain propositions which I'm open to sort of further deliberate and discuss. Constitutional morality, what does that suggest? This term as constitutional morality, it simply suggests that it's not merely a legal or policy oriented. Constitutional morality, I think the central theme it brings forth is a question of representation and legitimacy. That when is a political regime legitimate, and when is it in terms of representing its people? And constitutions present people's self-understanding of their own political identity. That's where constitutions are important. The constitutions provide us, it's a sort of a mechanism for the people, or the population to have a self-understanding, have a political identity of who they are, what are the political principles that they are, they have a consensus over, and what is the representational logic that they are willing to follow in terms of having a legitimate authority. But what we are witnessing today across globe is that all kinds of constitutional orders, which are fundamentally liberal democratic in nature, are in terms of some kind of a crisis or in some kind of a stress. So from US, if you look at Occupy Wall Street to Arab Spring to the Brazilian Spring to the kinds of political movements we are having in India, all across globe, liberal constitutionalism is in some kind of a crisis. So this is something for us to understand, with or without revolutionary movements. It's not necessary that only Maoist challenge. That was our understanding in 50s and 60s, that it is the extreme left or it is the armed struggles across globe, like in Colombia, and you had those armed rebellions in Latin America. Today what we are understanding is that it's not necessary that it's only revolutionary movements that need to challenge liberal constitutionalism. Very mainstream popular political mobilization today is also challenging constitutionalism. So that's my first, that there's a big shift, that liberal constitutionalism is under a different kind of stress today. Similarly, this crisis of liberal constitutionalism is coming today, especially in a country like India, not merely from the subaltern social groups, like we generally understand from the tribals or from those which are completely marginalized. I think the India, the case is that liberal constitutionalism is under a dual stress, both from the ruled as well as the rulers, the governed and the governors. Both, I think, have some sort of lost trust in liberal constitutionalism. Therefore, you have a ruling elite, dominant social groups in India also want to speak a language outside legal constitutional language. I think that's partly the crisis of the dominant social groups in India. I think the current political regime that we are witnessing in India is partly a representative of that kind of a logic, that its kind of populist mobilization is happening outside liberal institutional procedural language. And it's important for us to understand that there is some consent to this. That's what we witnessed in part of JNU struggle, the crisis that the current political regime instigated and institutionalized in JNU. To my surprise, while we were all sort of violated by the kind of breach of trust and the way they sort of manufactured this JNU crisis, I live in Vasant Kunj. I could see that generally when you're traveling in public transport, talking to neighbors, I was taken aback by seeing that there is some kind of a consent that this regime had, the way it dealt with JNU, this whole question of sedition, the way it formed the question of Kashmir. There is a large amount of, and the way it was, for instance, the lawyers beat up the JNUSU president Kanaya in the court premises. For our liberal sensibilities, all of this looks like terrible violation of rule of law and basic liberal principles, basic constitutional vision. But what is important to understand is there is some consent that is being mobilized today. And I think that is the strength on which the current right-wing political regime is working, is precisely that there is some sort of a consent to this extra institutional language. So it's important for us to understand that where does this consent to extra institutional language come from? So it is coming both from dominant groups. So if you look at the range of movements in India, from Patidars to Jats to the way Jats were mobilized in Haryana, that they've stopped trusting and strengthening liberal institutional procedures. Similar is, I think, the case of subaltern groups. Therefore, I think Maoists come there. I think Maoists are one representative political mobilization of subaltern groups like the tribals, who also have very weak, we should say, trust, and who also do not trust the liberal constitutionalism. So, in Indian case is, I think, in that sense a very unique case, where you have the stress on constitutionalism from both ends. So, it is the old Nehruian liberalism that we all built Indian democracy on. Today, we are suddenly seeing that the cracks are emerging from both ends. So, there are two types of questions for us, that till about 70s, I think we had some sort of a consensus. The Nehruian consensus fairly succeeded till the 70s. Post 1970s, it was the subaltern social groups with the breakout of the Naxalite movement in 1967 from the state Sumit comes from. That's where the Naxalbari movement began. And we thought 70s was a phase where gradually subaltern groups, the Dalits, the tribals, the landless were becoming impatient and started questioning constitutionalism. Therefore, from language of civil rights, we moved to the language of democratic rights. And we said right to protest, enlargement of the right to protest is what should be the spirit of constitution. And the debate in civil rights movement that I was part of was this, that whether constitution constrains civil rights language or does it provide. That was a big debate in civil rights movement. So, that was the phase of 80s and 90s. But post 90s, what we are suddenly witnessing is that why is it that even the elite stopped investing in institutions, in liberal institutions in India? I think the current political regime partly represents that kind of a consent, that it is not merely an authoritarian fascist regime, and that is what is the general discourse in JNUs, but I am continuously arguing with our friends, colleagues and students that while it has an authoritarian dimension, what should concern us more is the populist social base this authoritarianism has in this country, that it is also emerging out of a certain social base. What are the social forces that sort of consent towards this kind of an extra constitutional, extra institutional space? I think one clear example was, I think, the Bhopal encounter that we witnessed, where 8 of those accused were, I think it was in broad daylight shot. It was fairly clear that it was a fake encounter. But what was surprising is to find that the Indian so-called civil society in India had some sort of a consent to this kind of an extra institutional, extra judicial. Earlier, these extra judicial mechanisms were limited to the Maoists. Today, you see that they are being extended to Muslims, Islamic terrorism, and it can be many other social groups. So, what should really concern is that where did this social contract with Indian state break down? I think that is where I will raise a few questions. And one of the first questions that I would that would interest me is really this, that is it a breakdown of the state? What does this constitutional crisis, liberal constitutional crisis really throw up? What is it a signpost for? And what I read here is a very strange kind of a paradox in the Indian context, that some sort of a paradox between the concrete and the abstract. Well, bulk of the subaltern and social elite seems to have lost trust on institutions. There is an expansion of state. Now, how do we sort of understand this paradox? Post 1990s, we have seen more and more social groups demanding more from the state. So, there has been in that sense an expansion of citizenship post neoliberalism in India. India, I think, is one of the few countries where I think after implementation of neoliberal reforms, you have had a massive expansion of rights language, right to work, right to food, right to health. All these debates have been carrying on after 1990s in India. And there is a huge expansion of even welfare net in India. MNRG is a good example of that, where massive right to food and MNRG are two good examples that such massive expansion of welfareism has happened post neoliberalism. So, therefore, I think people are now demanding more of state, not less of state. So, in that sense, to say that we are not following a classical laissez-faire neoliberal model where neoliberalism means withdrawal of state. There is more of state more burden on the state, more expectation on the state. In that sense, there is a citizenship discourse between state and the citizens. But we want less of institutions. The trust in institutions, I think, is at its all-time low, whether it is universities, whether it's police, whether it is judiciary. Nobody trusts institutions in India. Institutions in that sense, that intermediary relation between citizen and state are the institutions, various kinds of state institutions, civic institutions. I think by and large Indian society, as I see Indian politics I observe, I think we are caught in this paradox between loss of trust on institutions, but dependence on state is growing. I think that is what is leading to an increasing securitization of the state. That you want more security from the state. And as I said, that the Bhopal encounter is one clear example, that you want more of state's security language, therefore there is more consent. Why do people consent in a fake encounter like Bhopal? Is partly because they don't trust either judiciary or police. You know, people across board, when I was talking about why a fake encounter like Simi, they said the police might eat money and let go these fellows. It's difficult to produce evidence in the courts. Public prosecutor can be corrupted in India. So nobody trusts any of the institutions. So as an alternative, you think it is better for the state to take a proactive measure and directly come and finish off, bump off these accused. This is a very strange paradox in Indian case, that increasing burden and that state should act is, I think, securitization of the state languages. That's where it is, which is what you find also in the Maoist. I think this is the dilemma even the Maoists are facing in India, that on one hand, their expansion in central India, much of Telangana, eastern parts of India, was partly because of this non-responsive nature of Indian institutions. You go to PDS system, there is massive corruption. You go to police, there is massive corruption. And Maoists, I think, expanded due to this non-deliverance, non-responsive character of institutions. But have people lost trust on the state? Certainly not. If you look at even Chhattisgarh, the electoral voter turnout is over 70% in Chhattisgarh, where you have, I think, perhaps the Maoist movement is at its strongest today. How do you explain this paradox, that in a state where there is a massive Maoist presence and there is a fair amount of social support of the tribals for the Maoists, how does one explain the fact that even the voter turnout is perhaps one of the highest in the same state? This is, I think, one of the paradoxes that this relation between constitutional morality and revolutionary praxis faces in India, that our constitution is in its institutional frame has perhaps collapsed, has failed. But something else seems to have succeeded, and I have not been able to really crack this paradox. Maybe some of you can help me understand that. How does one understand this dilemma between the concrete and the abstract? That in concrete institutional functioning, our trust is gradually declining. But in an abstract sense on the state, we seem to feel more dependent and we seem to make more and more demands on the state. So that's my first proposition between. So that's something that we can debate as to how to understand this kind of dilemma between. My second issue is in terms of the idea of post-19, as I said, is in terms of how to make institutions more effective and representative. I think what revolutionary movements really bring forth is this political agenda, that that can institutions in India can it be made more representative and more accountable. I think here also we are facing a huge dilemma in terms of the public discourse, because rights violations in India happen not merely because of violations of procedures, but they also happen in following procedures. So I think PIL is one good example in Indian case, that courts simply by following procedures delay the case so long. Your cases run for 12 to 15 years. That is not a violation of procedures. Your justice is being denied in this case precisely in following the procedures. The Anna Hazare movement was one such example. That Lokpal bill is that you want to circumvent and short circuit the procedural part of Indian democracy, that procedures are so elaborate in Indian case that all of us feel that following these procedures itself denies us justice. So, I think the second big question that I will throw up before you, that in Indian case, I think it cannot be the European model of simply stressing that having more checks and balances, more procedures is a way of making our institutions more accountable. I think much of violations, I would in fact argue the larger part of violations of rights in India happen precisely in following the procedures, not in violating them, because our procedures are so elaborate, and I think the rulers make a sufficient use of those elaborate procedures. That's partly links to my earlier point that I said, that's perhaps the reason why both the ruling elite and the subaltern groups both have lost trust in institutions, because your institutional procedures do not deliver at the end of the day. I think PIL is one interesting case that somebody do we as citizens support PIL? It is a good system for citizens to directly have access to courts, but I have my own doubts that what does PIL in the larger sense, what is it that it is going to institutionalize in public life, whether this kind of circumventing of procedures, PIL I think is symbolic of that courts, failure of courts to deliver is what, Balgopal used to make this very interesting analogy, that PIL is like the old bell in front of the king, you go and ring the bell and the king is going to deliver the justice. PIL gives you that kind of a sense, as if you go and file a PIL and the next moment justice will be delivered, but in most of the PIL cases we do not even know who the applicant is, and the PILs also keep on, endlessly they are stuck in the courts. So, this whole business of procedures, I think is something that we need to revisit, that what is it doing to the institutional dimension, that why have institutions become so opaque in Indian context, which also links us to the rise of this kind of right-wing populism that we are witnessing in India. Much of the consent that right-wing populism in India witnesses today comes from this institutional vacuum, comes from this institutional failure. What right therefore does is further weakens the institution and proves that justice and effective decision making can be delivered outside the institutional frame. I think Mr. Narendra Modi as a symbol is precisely this, that power is vested now in an individual. Therefore, we are moving to some sort of a presidential election, reposing faith in an individual, and populist language. Therefore, today if you see all the political leaders where they are speaking in this current political regime, it is a complete populist language which is extra institutional. And this is not just with India, you can also see Mr. Donald Trump, the way he talks is in terms of some complete violation of rule of law. As a president he says, I will have more torture. Uma Bharti the other day said that when I was a chief minister, I used to torture rape accused, So, this kind of a language which is taking increasing consent, and which is what I would call it as a populist turn. Narendra Modi is coming and saying, if you have a case like Rohit Vemula, and when we are asking more accountability, he says, come and kill me, so I mean as if killing an individual. So, this kind of a populist jargon that has come, if you have to really upturn this kind of a current political regime, it's precisely in understanding that institutional vacuum, that institutionals when they do not deliver, then people seem to be reposing faith in a populist language, where individuals come and take. So, if you see Mr. Modi's speeches everywhere, he says that give me the responsibility, I am your Pradhan Sevak, so I am going to deliver. So, you have a faceless institutional neoliberal economy. Here is an individual who is coming to tell you that I am willing to take responsibility, I think creates huge amount of trust. So, for us, those of us who are interested in this left liberal space, for us the big challenge really is that how do we rebuild the representational logic in institutions, because we do believe that you cannot have this kind of, this whole business of direct democracy is a very dangerous business in any liberal democracy. You cannot have a direct democracy where citizens will directly go and sort of be policy makers, directly go and put, this is it looks very effective. I think Mr. Anna Hazare kicked off this kind of an ugly debate in Indian, having five wise men and having one Lokpal, and what is the trust? How do we have trust that we will find these 5 most cleanest individuals on earth and who will be part of the Lokpal? What is their own accountability? What is the procedures by which they will be held accountable? But we all believe that this will make institutions very effective. Justice will be immediately delivered. This is like the Bollywood version of it. One hero who demolishes everyone in your climax and delivers the justice. That we are all used to those kind of happy endings. So, those of us interested in left liberal space, I think against this kind of populist authoritarian regime that we are witnessing, I think one big question will be what do we do with institutions? For a massive country of this diversity with this kind of mammoth population, this kind of a huge geographical area, and which is what I think US is also presently facing that crisis. That people even in US would lose trust. So, they are saying he is giving all physical things. I will build a wall across Mexico and US, as if wall is a good sort of a best bet against immigrants, and they have nothing to do with facts, there is nothing to do with evidence. So, in that sense we are in a post-truth. Media has been throwing up this term post-truth. I think this post-truth business that we are all talking about, which is in some sense also post-constitutional, precisely comes from the lack of trust in institutions. And this lack of trust, as I am arguing, is not merely because the institutions, there is an extra institutional language, but also precisely because institutional functioning itself fails you. I think judiciary is a very good example of that, we do not trust going to judiciary precisely because the amount of time and money it invests, that there is no procedural violence there. Simply following procedures, I think violates your basic rights. So, I think one big question we will have to raise is that how do we bring back this political culture required for an institutional order? I think Nehruvian socialism assumed that we do have that political culture, or at least attempted to build in its nascent sense this political culture, where it has not been a sufficient project. The question could be, does this kind of institutional trust and this institutional functioning is certain kind of a social equality a prerequisite for it? In India, we have had democracy before industrialization. We have had we broke a lot of sequence compared to Europe. So, we were mass democracy, universal franchise before we achieved social equality or industrialization. This, I think, creates a post-colonial democracy with different kinds of challenges. So, do we really have the social equality necessary, which is what leads to, I think, some kind of social gestation, which takes me to the question of, if you see the question of secularism, Nehruvian secularism, I think, is an interesting case that if one were to ask, why did the Nehruvian secularism in one sense fail? It's precisely because of this, that Nehruvian secularism is such an idealistic imagination of expecting a majority religious community to be extremely tolerant and generous towards minorities. And that is a spirit that is institutionalized in Indian notion of secularism. Now, we need to now ask questions outside its legal institutional frame. When would a majority community be so tolerant, or why should the majority community be so generous towards minorities? I think Nehruvian secularism went with Nehruvian socialism. That socialism expected a certain kind of social and economic equality, which is what I think was the basis for us to expect that Indian citizens belonging to majority Hindu community would be tolerant, rational and generous. Post 90s, what we are experiencing is withdrawal of socialism, but continuing with secularism. I think one question that we need to really pose in today's context, can India remain secular without having a welfare state? Can we afford to have a neoliberal economic regime in the economy and secularism as our political and social goal? Can these two models go together? I think the rise of, again, this kind of a right-wing populism comes at the point of this tension between secularism and withdrawal of collapse of welfare state. So, today you have welfare policies without a welfare state, without a welfare language. So, that collapse of mutual trust, cooperative relations, concern for other social groups, which is what Nehruvian socialism was in a sense, as a social ethic was based, that I think we completely destroyed with 1990s with neoliberalism. But we continue to expect the majority community to be generous, tolerant towards minorities. I think this is completely an unworkable model, and this is where I think simply to imagine that a society based on a constitutional morality will remain secular and which is what I think to a long extent Nehru and post-Nehruvian Congress kind of a system depended on, was precisely this, that they believed that secularism is a constitutional norm, believed that it's a constitutional morality, without really understanding what is its social ethics, what is its social base in society for that kind of a constitutional morality to survive in spirit and substance. We introduced a model of neoliberalism and continued to expect a secular foundation. I think that is where the right wing has an edge, where it got the nuances of this debate, and that is when they pushed this kind of a majoritarian logic, which in an extra institutional language, that where you can directly take action. I think this is very interesting to see how this notion of direct democracy, direct vigilantism, works in the context of corruption, works in the context of Muslims, works in the context of Maoists, and works in the context of secular debate. That we have developed a public discourse. I think what Anna Hazare's movement's debate did is that it threw up our lack of trust on public institutions. Therefore, this whole business of direct democracy is precisely, I think, signifies our lack of trust on institutions. And this has, I think, happened from, it was only the Maoists who did it till the 70s, but post 1990s, this has become now a mainstream phenomenon. That it's not merely Maoists who do not trust the institutions in the state in India, or just the institutions in India, but it has become a much more generic phenomena where a large range of social groups have stopped trusting. And this has happened partly because, as I said, post 1990s, there is a massive, lot of sociologists are now reflecting on this, from Jigmet Bauman onwards, that insecurity has become a pervasive feature of all social classes. This again takes me to the social base of institutions, that why is insecurity so pervasive in India is precisely because the Indian middle class, unlike the European middle class, the expansion of Indian middle class happened with insecurity. Post 1990s, with privatization, there was a growth of contractualization of work, there was a withdrawal of social security measures, we witnessed also a jobless growth. So Indian middle class, you all must have heard of golden handshake, hire and fire policy, VRS. So unlike European middle class, which came with industrialization, which was interested in long-term planning, which was interested in institutions, because the social interests of middle class and democratic institutions converge in the European case. In the Indian case, they, I think, were crisscross. Indian middle class, therefore, was a highly insecure middle class, and this middle class, therefore, had never invested in institutions, it's never trusted in institutions. And part of it, as Rob Jenkinson's reforms by stealth, part of the reforms itself were implemented by undermining institutions. I think now a clear example we are witnessing a third round is the way RBI has been undermined by current political regime. This whole entire business of demonetization, whatever its effectiveness on corruption, more than that, I think what should really worry us is the way the autonomy of RBI has been undermined by the current political regime. So this we are now going to witness undermining of economic, because banking system, as we all understand, just works on trust. Monetary value works on trust, and if you undermine trust on RBI institutions, what it is going to make is you're going to make your currency very volatile. But that is a direction in which we are moving, precisely because we have developed a public discourse in India from various angles in terms of undermining institutions, whether it is the anti-corruption movement by Anna Hazare, whether it is the Maoist struggle, or whether it is the populist right-wing mobilizations. All these discourses are converging in terms of undermining institutions. And therefore, our question really would be, how do we bring back faith in institutional structures? And there I think it's a very big challenge, because it's, as I said, sheer diversity and range makes effective institutional functioning very difficult in India. And therefore, there is a lot of social space for extra institutional social dialogue. Now, how do you democratize that extra institutional social dialogue? I think is a very big question for us, those of interested in, as I said, liberal institutional language. I think those are the three big questions I really wanted to, insecurity, populism, and now in terms of coming to Maoism, because Sumit was also interested in that, how do we then understand revolutionary struggles in this context? What is interesting is this, that that as democracies are becoming populist and failing to deliver, democratic imagination is spreading. And this is again a very complex dilemma. I'm writing something on this in terms of how to understand populist, much of critical theory is dealing with this. The democracy is becoming more global in its imagination in its populist version. So if we want to really understand democracies today, I think there is a dual process that is happening. One is in terms of the reach, democracy is becoming wider. So people in one sense are feeling today more included in democracies. It is precisely because it is democracies are working outside liberal institutional language. So people today can express very common sense reasoning as against constitutional reasoning. I mean, this is one good example to understand why democracies come closer to the people today. That earlier in the Nehruvian, if you compare Nehruvian democratic model to current democratic model, Nehruvian democratic model was based on a liberal reasoning. Secularism is a liberal reasoning of tolerance. It was not an organic reason that is born from your everyday. Today your everyday prejudices, your everyday insecurities, your everyday subjective emotions become the source of your reasoning. And that is what is being also taken into the policy frame. Like Donald Trump's, it's a ridiculous imagination to think that immigrants will stop by building a wall. He wants to build a wall across US and Mexico, and he wants Mexico to pay for that. It is his idea to build a wall. It is like you want to build a house and you want your neighbor to pay for your building a house. So he has this policy. But what clicks in this? It clicks because it is not based on a legal, rational reasoning, but it is based on a reasoning of subjective emotions. When you feel insecure, this kind of a policy makes sense. So in one sense, I spoke last week in Jamia where I made this point that state is becoming an emotional being today. State was supposed to be structured, rule bound, constitutional, procedural. Today what is happening is that state is a very emotional being. Therefore you have our Prime Minister who enjoys theatrics. One day he is laughing in Japan, the other day he is weeping in Parliament, third day he is the kind of language he uses against opposition leaders. It's a very emotional state today. It's something you can identify. This is a person with whom the state, who represents the state. So this is doing two things, as I said, that democracy in one sense is becoming inclusive. That we all now feel, I think subaltern especially feels part of this state because you have unburdened him in terms of strong institutional language. That you don't have to learn expertise, you don't have to have technical expertise of law to understand a policy like demonetization. It's a very common sense understanding because demonetization works, people get convinced because our understanding of corruption is not in terms of informal sector, non-taxed economic transactions and all. Your understanding is a Bollywood understanding of corruption. Those people who have put cash money under their beds. This is what Bollywood has routinely shown us for the last 40 years, that all black markets stove their cash away under their beds or in their tijoris. So suddenly when you demonetize, people feel that it's a very effective move. So this popular symbolism that democracies have moved towards, I think have a dual movement. In terms of policy frame, they are becoming more and more ineffective. But in terms of perception and feeling and experience, state is moving closer to the people. It's an emotional state where you can identify. It's using an everyday language. So I think, therefore, if to understand democracies, we'll have to understand this. On one hand is the reach of democracies. Therefore, I said democracies in this sense are becoming more and more inclusive. But democracies over a period of time in terms of social inequalities, economic inequalities, democracies are becoming more and more ineffective. Because state is becoming ineffective partly because of this global local, that all states have lost economic sovereignty. So therefore, they do not have a hold on policy frame anymore. They are as helpless as any one of us. So loss of economic sovereignty, but that is being replaced by political populism. In this is how do you evaluate this kind of a democracy? I think is a fairly complex business. But in that sense, that therefore you have more voter turnout. If you look at state after state, the voter turnout is increasing. There is no distress. There is no rejectionism. There is no loss of hope. There is more hope. That is, I think, a slogan like Achhe Din reflects. More hope for people. Now we can ask, where is this hope coming from? State is failing to deliver. Your inflation rate is gone up. You are still a jobless economy, but people are investing so much of faith in political system. Where does this come from? I think it comes from this populist term. And I think this is precisely the challenge for revolutionary praxis today, that revolutionary movements have to make sense. Mere critique of democracy as hegemonic, as I said, is now a very tricky business. That democracy is hegemonic, liberal democracy in its constitutional frame has failed to deliver, all that is true. But as I said, the other part of the story is democracy is having this populist appeal. So for revolutionaries, not only India, across globe, but more so for the Maoist movement today, I think one of the biggest challenges they are facing, and if you routinely interact or read their magazines, the sense you get from their public intellectuals and their public documents is precisely this, that I think democracy is one of the biggest challenges they are facing, which they are acknowledging, gradually they are acknowledging. It's a very, it's ironical, just when we are having this kind of a democracy, it is Maoists who are beginning to acknowledge democracy is one big challenge for them. Till 70s and 80s, they had this will that democracies would get exposed, and the limitation of democracy will get exposed, and that's when the revolutionary project will become viable. But today it's very strange that the Maoists are taking democracy more seriously. They feel that it's a bigger challenge than what they have earlier felt. Some of you know, in Odisha, in fact, for the first time the Maoists took part in local elections, in panchayat elections, and they won all those. And state, the Odisha state government institutionalized a commission to inquire how did they win. Instead of acknowledging that they have won, they have institutionalized a commission saying that how come all Maoist sympathizers have won in local panchayat elections. So this is a very interesting turn for revolutionary movements to understand that as institutional, so it's a three level, institutional legitimacy has collapsed, dependent state is growing, but and at a social level, populist reach of democracies is laterally increasing. And therefore, for revolutionary movements, which earlier banged on completely sort of debunking constitution, at a second level now Maoists are also thinking about the critique of Indian constitution, which is very interesting. So when we have moved right, Maoists seem to be becoming more and more liberal. Now Maoists are more cautious in terms of the critique of constitution. This was a debate in 80s between the liberal left and the Maoists. The liberal left believed that Indian constitution is a fairly progressive document, but the Maoists always believe that it's a bourgeois document with the right to private property as its basis. Today the Maoists have it's turned a full wheel, it's turned a full circle where they are willing to engage with Indian constitution. They have started going back to the ideals of secularism and socialism. They are now, if you debate with them, they are taking this more seriously. Now they feel that Indian constitution should not be debunked, but constitutional frame. Because somewhere they seem to have realized that it is this constitutional frame which allowed them that social space for protest. In spite of massive state repression, fake encounters, to have mass organizations, to have a civil rights movement in India, to have a middle class presence among lawyers, doctors. In Telangana, they had huge middle class presence. All this was possible precisely because of a constitutional frame, which what I call the constitutional morality based on rule of law and some sense of justice. So Maoists today are rethinking whether they actually have sort of jumped the gun by debunking constitution way too fast. So today you have a very interesting scenario where you have a populist pressure on Indian constitution. When people in 70s had trust on constitutions, Maoists debunked it. Today when there is a populist debunking of constitution and institutional language, and you have a right-wing mobilization of that spirit of populism, you have the left and radical left which is increasingly speaking the constitutional language. So this, I think, as I understand Maoist movement today, they are increasingly taking this language seriously, of constitutional language seriously. Because what they perhaps realize today is that, as Nancy Fraser says, that socialism is cognitively a compelling idea, but experientially very distanced. How do you make socialist politics, how do you make radical left politics experientially closer to people? I think what the populist turn in democracy has taught us is that we need to take the experiential dimension seriously. I think Dalit politics for some time has been arguing this in terms of lived experience is what matters. How do you, what is that socialism? How would socialism feel in its social and experiential dimension, not merely as an ideological political program? If you have to counter this populist turn in democracy, you will have to generate an experiential dimension to socialism, not merely as a political ideology. And the other important turn I think which we are witnessing is that globally we understand we really do not know how to make societies and people equal. That was the language of 60s and 70s. Today, post neoliberalism, while the urge for equality has gone up, I don't think we know how to make what equality means. How do you make people equal? I think nationalization projects have failed. Mass redistribution, land reforms as a projects have failed. Poverty alleviation programs by and large have failed all across the globe. I think another big challenge with Maoist movement is going to think is perhaps this business of equality is way more complex than what we have assumed. That equality as a class-centric idea of equality is perhaps no longer the singular emphasis on class. I think by and large now we are coming to that consensus. And therefore, we are talking more in terms of social equality between castes, races, gender and so on and so forth. Even there, I don't think we have an idea what does it actually mean to make groups equal, except in terms of equality of opportunity. So, equality as an ideal itself I think today has cracked up, that we really do not know what equality means, as we do not know what freedom means. Now, the old liberal ideals that we all banged on, that we knew that they had certain universal appeal. Today I think we are increasingly coming to understand that rationality on which these global universal liberal ideals were based are today now we are understanding that we actually know very little about them, that these were more of ideals rather than something that can be concretized in terms of social and political programs. I think Maoist movement and all radical left struggles all over globe I think are facing these new challenges, that collapse of ideals of equality, our understanding of equality. The other big turn, as I said, is that extra institutional populist experiential dimension that democracies today are spreading on. How does a left movement, and I'll conclude with this, that I think the big challenge for us left liberals and left movement is that what do you do with this extra institutional populist space? Some of the social political theories like Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau have argued that we need to build what they refer to as left populism. Now, in India, can we have something called left populism? Does our social culture or everyday life, everyday cultural ethos, do they really allow us to build socialist politics based on everyday culture? I think this is a highly complex business, because in Indian society is fairly complex in terms of it has all these multiple dimensions. From one end, we look like an extremely prejudiced, we are highly hierarchized, we are very conservative, we are a very status quo society. I think Indians, if you go abroad and meet, I think are one of the most racist communities that you face are Indians. But in terms of liberal spaces of freedom of expression, criticism, India also comes across as a society which is fairly tolerant, which can go along with multiple voices. So I think my big question that one would leave you with, even for revolutionary movements today, is one way that if we talk about constitutional morality and bringing back rule of law and constitution, we'll have to today talk not merely in terms of an institutional language, but we'll have to talk about this populist space that has exploded, where everyday emotions, subjective emotions, everyday prejudices, everyday ideas, everyday rationality, which is commonsensical, is today finding a political expression. That is the reason why you can speak an outside institutional language. There's a public display of your emotions, anger, disappointment. This, I think, in one sense, in a post-colonial context, I would argue is a big relief. I think this is bridging this huge gap between the left liberal elite and the subaltern. I think that's where the Nehruvian project, the limitation of the Nehruvian project perhaps was that that those socialist, liberal, left ideals took an institutional shape, and that institutions were restricted to a middle class and urban elite. Perhaps they did not percolate all the way to the subaltern groups. Today, with the explosion of this populism, I think the right wing had its first, made their first bet, and I think they have succeeded in rightly capturing that there is an explosion of this populism. But obviously, they are mobilizing that part of the populist social ethics which is hierarchical, which is prejudicial, which is exclusionary, which is violent, which is intolerant. Now, for rest of us in terms of liberal left, what is the space we have outside the constitutional institutional language, or how do we combine constitutions and populism? Can we really combine a secular, democratic, socialist ideals with populism in India, and ideals which speak with or maybe even outside institutional language? Is it something that is possible, or is it that populism in India will always have a right wing tinge? Because our dominant social culture, everyday culture, is more of intolerance because of caste, religion and gender hierarchies that we witness, or is it possible there is something in the popular culture that can also be used by left populism, is a question that I am still baffled and I don't have an answer. So, I will end and expect some of you will crack some of these dilemmas. Thank you.